Working Cows Podcast, episode 296. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. Very excited to be joined today by Kent Solberg and Doug Voss. They are with Understanding Ag, and so bring a lot of value to the table, and really excited to have a conversation with them a little bit outside of the Working Cows purview, but it is still cows, right? The dairy cattle are still cows, and they can go to work for people, and they can carry a lot of the load that we can take a lot of the load off their back by putting them to work for us. And so really excited to just kind of stretch my mind a little bit and expand my mind a little bit as far as looking at a different sector of this industry and seeing how soil health principles apply to that industry as well. So, Kent, Doug, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great to be here.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, very excited for this conversation. It's going to be a new one for me as far as just kind of a little bit more of exposure to the dairy industry. So I guess we'll just kind of start with you guys giving a little bit of your background as it relates to dairy, as it relates to soil health, and kind of your journey in that way. So we'll just start alphabetically with Kent, I guess.
Yeah, very good. Great. Thanks, Clay. Farmer for 30 years in Minnesota here. I'm in Northwest Minnesota. Bulk of that's been in dairy and working with dairy. I've been doing dairy consulting for about 15 years. Grazing is a big part of our operation, and we've been working with the principles of soil health through the lion's share of that time.
Doug?
Yeah. I'm Doug Voss. I'm central Minnesota, so we're not quite in the Arctic Circle like Kent is, but we can see it from where we're at. Where we're at in central Minnesota, we're the third generation on the farm that we're on now. Historically, it's been a dairy. Currently, we've converted the operation to a custom grazing operation that supports the organic dairy industry. And we've got other arms of custom grazing on other public lands. And that's where my wife, Beth, and I are raising our 5 sons.
Very good. Very good. Kent, you mentioned being a grazing dairy. That's unique on some level. Is it not, as far as dairies are concerned?
To some degree, for those dairy producers who are shipping milk through an organic label, they're required to do that. They need 30% of their dry matter intake for 120 days to be off of a grazing system. But for others, it's a little more unique. But we found it certainly opens up a host of opportunities for a dairy farm, and can go a long way to meeting a host of goals, including reduce input costs and increase net margin.
Sure. Yeah. I try to capture some bonus content on most of the episodes that I record. And recently I was talking to Dr. Larry Tranel from the Iowa State Extension. And I asked him a question about consolidation in the dairy industry. And he said that it was really ramped up over the last 3 to 5 years. Doug, why have we seen that consolidation, and what have been some of the ramifications of it?
Well, you can look at it from a number of different perspectives, but is the idea that get bigger, get out. And so between competition and leverage, as far as where your position is, maybe in marketing or what have you, but then the economy of scale is part of that. But I would say that it's from the perspective of a perceived efficiency. And so, platforms of educational organizations are focused on looking where the industry is going. And so where the industry is going is consolidation and getting bigger, but it's usually from a limited number of perspectives. And so that's where the contrast between the grazing dairy might be exaggerated even more, because it's looking at things from more lenses than just simply an economic or efficiency. And then also lifestyle. I mean, if you're looking at only a certain margin profit per cow, for example, how do you manage that? And so when you get to the point that you have to have employees, how many do you have to have? How many cows do you have to milk in order to get your net profit that you're looking for? And so oftentimes that's encouraged by financial organizations to get bigger. So the trend is there. Obviously, it's going to mirror a lot of the other industries out there. I mean, every other one, it looks like, as far as commodity production, has gone down the same road. But it is just that from that perspective, commodity production. So we do need to identify and have the conversation just a little bit longer when we're looking at whether we're producing commodities or whether we're producing food. And of course, that conversation can go on for a long time, but the industry is looking at it from an industry perspective. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why we do have the expansion and the scale that we have, because it's interesting to know that our cattle numbers aren't changing much, especially in our region here. It's simply the number of farms. And so that kind of gives us an idea of this consolidation and the scope of it. So and then with that, we have the results of that, right? So what are the results of that, whether they're economically, socially, or environmentally? And oftentimes the scale of these operations is under this perceived efficiency because we can haul more product. But what is the overall effect of that? And I think that's one of the big differences that you'll find with conversations that you have with folks involved with regenerative agriculture is we're looking at things from a whole. And so the grazing dairy offers an interesting contrast compared to the other. If we're looking at providing this bed and breakfast idea with the industrial ag model, we're painting ourselves in a corner to do some things that we may realize that we want the opportunity to do in the future. So, we have to look at things from all these perspectives when we're making these management decisions, not any different than any other commodity ag group or industrial model in agriculture as a whole.
Yeah, Clay, I would add some of this also goes back to training and education in the dairy realm. Through sort of conventional training and education pathways, the model that's being primarily used in commodity production, the only answer to increasing efficiency or gross revenue is increasing scale. And they don't know, if we don't know what we don't know that option's on the table. We don't understand that's an option on the table. And when that's the predominant training and education that's out there, that influences, social pressure from peers, from family, even from generation to generation. And so that plays a role in this increase. Another thing we see is, many of these farms the large ones are family operations. They're LLCs. They're operating as a legal corporation. And the way to keep or add more people to the farm is just, expand cows, expand acres. And so now it's allowing multiple generations to be there, to be part of that. They want to be part of dairy, but the only answer to that they see from their training and education is to expand in scope and size.
Yeah.
Not necessarily looking at other models.
Right, for sure. Yeah, you don't know what's out there. You don't know what options exist as far as other ways to approach your livelihood. A couple of things, Doug, as a follow-up to what you mentioned there. You talked about that difference between commodity and food. Where's the line in your mind, or is it always kind of going to be a blur and a gradient? And how do you think about those things?
I think of them differently than I probably did even 5 years ago. We like to draw lines and we like to make distinctions, whether we're looking at commodities or food. And the fact of the matter is that it's all on a continuum. We have really good organic producers, and we have really good organic producers that are really bad at addressing their impact on the resource. And so that's going to be reflected in the products they produce. We could have a conventional farm, which would be considered conventional. And I don't like labels because we have to ask details about each individual farm in order to really understand it, right? So I don't like the camps at all. I don't like the labels at all. And that's one of my favorite things about soil health in general, because I'll say it in every conversation I have an opportunity to, is that it's the one thing that we can have a conversation about that crosses all tribal boundaries. So it doesn't matter where you've come from, what you believe, where you're going, as long as you drink water, eat food, and breathe air, it should matter to you. And so everything we're talking about when we're talking about dairy or anything is that it's the impact on that soil and the repercussions of our management. So I don't want people to think that, oh, because it's one thing or the other, it's healthy for me, or it's not healthy for me, or it's protecting the environment, or it's degrading the environment. We have to be curious just a little longer and ask lots of questions.
It's almost like there's a set of underlying principles that guides what we do. And we can apply those principles to all kinds of different operations, whether they're row crop farms or dairies or ranches that are all grass. It's almost like there's these 6 principles that kind of form the foundation of everything that we're doing, and we can apply those to whatever we're doing. It doesn't really matter what label we put on it. So I think that's an important thing to notice. One other thing, Doug, is you mentioned this term bed and breakfast. What did you mean by that?
So the idea by bed and breakfast is the dairy industry for years has been focused on cow comfort. And cow comfort in the dairy industry means that you only walk so many feet to get to your bunk. You have plenty of bunk space, and you have this beautifully groomed free stall that you can lay down whenever you want to. And the furthest you should have to walk is between there, the holding area, and the parlor. And, well, I mean, any living species, if that's the limitations they have in whatever situation they have, I mean, a cow, in my opinion, was originally intended to go find their own food to some degree. And in the process of doing that, they can help maintain and promote health in that ecosystem that's going to produce their next bite of food, as opposed to us separating ourselves from that whole process. So when I say bed and breakfast, I mean this total confinement. The animal's got to be under this bed and breakfast model where, it's the approach out in the field and how we incorporate and use that animal to produce a good product for us, but then also to help promote the ecology of the resource that we're working with.
Yeah. And I think you start to see the impact there on the food, right? If that's the environment that those cows live in, I think that there's going to be some effect on the what is produced by those cows. And so would you agree with that statement?
Well, I would, and especially if, again, we're looking at the results of this consolidation. We're looking at focusing and limiting what we're growing for those livestock. We're not focusing on diversity so much. Not that we can't, and there's not opportunities, but the current trend in dairy is, grow 2 or 3 things as effectively as we can, get the fertility back out there with whatever's left in our process to get back on the fields, which is an issue in and of itself. But that's the division I'm talking about. So that's it's focused on different aspects, and it's got limitations.
So it seems to me that pendulums swing in agriculture, in every sector, in every business, in church. Even I'm a pastor of a local church, and I have been involved in local church ministry for 16 years. And trends swing in that field too. And I think that agriculture is not immune to that. Dairy is not immune to that. So do you anticipate seeing this trend of consolidation continue, or will that trend start to swing back the other way? How do you think about some of those things?
I do expect the trend to continue in the consolidation from the majority of the industry. We've got other areas of the industry that aren't necessarily. We do have organic industries that, like Kent said, they're required, for example, to have 30% of their dry matter intake in grazing. That's something very different, and that's going to have a drastic impact on the logistics of some of the expansion of these larger operations. If you've got 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 cows and up, to get them back to their milking facility, and even the lanes to get them to pasture is a challenge, right? Logistically, that's something to consider. So that's gonna have an impact on the ability for those operations to scale. But yeah, as far as the industry as an overall whole, it looks like that trend is going to continue with those exceptions.
Sure.
Some of those exceptions, though, are, what's the consumer looking for? What does the consumer want? And they're speaking with a pretty loud voice. There are processors and food companies that are listening. to that consumer demand. That doesn't necessarily mean all of dairy is listening to that, but these companies understand that the consumer wants certain things. There's been some real spikes in that interest. 3 years ago here, we saw it when there were supply chain disruptions due to COVID. Those who are doing building their own product or processing their own product and selling it saw anywhere from 200 to 2,000% jump in demand for product. There's a lot of young people I talk to interested in, being in dairy and doing their own processing and direct marketing their own product, and they see the demand out there. It's a lot of smaller outfits are seeing this. Is that a huge chunk of the total dairy industry? No, but it's certainly a growing demand of it. So while we're seeing growth and consolidation, we're also seeing growth in alternative products that people feel more connected to. They feel that it's meeting their health and wellness needs. They feel that it's meeting environmental goals and meeting some of those concerns. And so, and then there's the whole water quality thing. A large part of dairy is located in the Great Lakes states, and there's a lot of concern within the lake states about water quality. And through policy, they're challenging or making it more difficult for some of this consolidation too. And so there's going to be limits to some of this, but the general trend, as Doug said, is it's going to continue for the foreseeable future.
Sure. Yeah. Kent, what about small dairies? Are they viable in the future?
Oh, yeah. As I just talked about, there's a lot of them looking at doing their own processing. Now that takes a different skill set. It adds complexity to that. It's not just as simple as, rolling out cheddar cheese and making money or whatever, or ice cream or whatever. Where we're seeing a lot of opportunity for small dairies are in those states where dairy isn't a major player, because we tend to see less regulatory oversight. A lot of that regulatory oversight is to protect a certain aspect of the market. And where there's less of that, there's more opportunity, and people will gravitate towards that. And now with our ability, with online purchasing and the ability to ship overnight through multiple carriers, that opens up a host of opportunities too. And so there are people looking to capitalize on this, but it's a process, not an event. We're also seeing, the definition of small is a bit of a challenge in dairy industry-wide. Anything under 1,000 cows is now considered small, and a lot of people wouldn't call that small, but that's kind of how the consolidation has gone. But for dairies that are, we'll just say small, due to lack of a better term right now, that are small, making the changes to focus on soil health, to use the regenerative principles, can really, really help their bottom line, help keep them viable for the foreseeable future, help them actually become models for how other small dairies who choose to stay in that small size range can stay viable. And they get a lot of good attention, especially when it comes to things like water quality.
Sure. And, I think that one of the challenges in direct marketing and some of those things is, or you have to develop your own market, I guess.
That's correct.
If you are raising commodities, quote unquote, if you're raising commodities, you've got checkoff dollars that are doing a lot of that market work for you. They are doing the marketing for you. And once it leaves your farm, you're never seeing it again, and you don't know who ended up with it and all those kinds of things. So, and I think those are kind of some of the challenges that you're talking about as far as the small dairies and what they're facing. But are there other challenges that you see, and how are they overcoming those challenges?
So a big one is, scrutiny by regulatory agencies on manure management. That's one we hear a lot about. Prior to fertilizer prices spiking here a year or two ago, one of the biggest questions we were getting is, what do I do with all this manure? It was a challenge for those that are set up in a confinement model and dealing with slurry. And so we were working with a lot of folks on there. The good news is there's ways to do that. It's just a matter of that challenge, stepping up to that challenge. The input costs, supply chain disruptions are a big thing. The consolidation of dairies, we're seeing loss of support services for those dairies, but as they move to a more regenerative type model, there's less need for those things. So it's building some cushion into their operation, both logistically, labor-wise, and financially. And so, there's lots of challenges in dairy. When it's a cropping system, it's a little more, we'll just say, simplified. When we add the whole marketing piece in there and being able to get everything you need to keep a dairy up and running, and when those starts disappearing, that's a lot more complicated. But if we can find ways, as we work with dairies, we like to find that low-hanging fruit. What's going to help them move forward, gain some confidence, start seeing some benefits from that in reduced input costs and a bunch of resource issues and health of the animals. They want to take it further, and it's help retaining the viability of some of those farms as they move forward.
Yeah. What about the demand for raw milk? Is that something that people are is there a lot of hurdles there? I think you mentioned earlier that a lot of the regulatory hurdles that people face tend to be in places where there's kind of an established dairy industry. And so is that kind of what you're talking about, that there's a regulation against raw milk?
Yeah, it varies so much from state to state to state. The regulations in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa are very different than North and South Dakota or Pennsylvania or whatever. And so there is demand for that stuff. It seems to be a growing demand. And where people have those opportunities, they can expand on that and make it work, or people are figuring out how to make it happen within the context of the regulatory things that are in place in their state.
Sure. Very good. How are you seeing small dairies? Either one of you or both can speak to this. How are you seeing small dairies apply the principles and rules of regenerative agriculture?
So some of the easiest things for them is the principle of diversity. Adding diversity in a dairy farm is relatively easy. We have multiple classes of livestock to feed. We can use a lot of these alternative forages to build diversity in the crop rotation. We can build diversity in those perennial hay seedings. That one's pretty straightforward and easy for many of them to do. And that can open up, and then keeping the ground covered, keeping the soil armored. That can be a very, very big one that's fairly easy to implement. Minimizing disturbance out on the soil. One of the first things is just how they're managing that manure, especially slurry manure. We can change when and how we apply that slurry manure that's minimizing that soil disturbance, and keeping it as a valuable agronomic resource on that farm. Another low-hanging fruit is, what are we doing with these dry cows and especially bred heifers, these larger animals that still eat a large amount of feed? We can use them as a soil health tool. We can use them to distribute manure. We can use them to harvest some of these cover crops and alternative crops, all in one process. And when people get their mind wrapped around that and understand the logistics of making that happen and that technology, it can be super powerful economically and ecologically for these dairies.
So, with that, it's important to understand that small dairies have huge advantages because they're so nimble to change compared to a large operation. When you have to, meet 3 times, develop a subcommittee, and determine whether or not you should add another crop to the cover crop mix, that's a big challenge as compared to just making the decision and being able to monitor the day after the cattle start consuming that product, whether or not it made a difference in your milk tank or not. And so it also forces a little bit more of a holistic perspective on things. So when you look at things from that perspective, you just tend to manage differently. A lot of dairies, a lot of the large ones, they subcontract out. They don't have control over the land. They're simply gauging the success of their forage production based on production, not on composition. I mean, they're looking at it from a nutrient evaluation, but as we know too, there's far more than, the macro and micronutrients. We've got phytonutrients and the effect that those have on animals. That's not something that's on everybody's radar. But from a smaller perspective, and you have a farmer that knows, we've got a cow in the herd for 18 years, not because they checked it on the reports, but the fact that they've been milking that cow for that long, or whatever the case might be. They know there's longevity there. those types of things have a big impact. And the biggest thing alone is the smaller dairies have the most opportunity about appropriately integrating the livestock on the landscape. And there's no more efficient way to do that than asking the animal to consume their forage whenever appropriate. And even in our northern climates, right? We've got advantages because, we've got a narrow growing season, but we've also got free concrete for part of the year. And so if we've got an opportunity to get cattle on the land with feeding out on the landscape, we can capitalize off of natural efficiencies that we don't have in a confinement operation. We're simply losing way too much nutrient by having them do their business in confinement, capturing whatever we do at the time, and then at whatever losses, get it back on the landscape at our expense. I mean, that's the big thing I keep thinking of, is that I don't know that the vast majority of operators understand that we don't have to accept those losses. And it'd be different if they were giving out free manure spreaders and given the labor there to put it back out in the field at our loss, but it's all additional cost. And so the small farmers cannot, they can be nimble. Today it's raining and it's maybe not appropriate to go down to the bottom end of that pasture because it's just not going to be good tomorrow. But hey, we can hold the animals back or graze a different area of the farm because we're only moving 100 animals compared to 1,000 animals.
So the profitability question, there's just tons of opportunity. All of these things we listed from a holistic standpoint can start tying themselves together, and we can start addressing other issues on the farm, such as labor, cow longevity, the need for growing as many replacement heifers as we did in the past. A lot of these farms, as animal health goes up, as they when they stay around in the herd longer, there's less heifers we need to raise, which is a huge cost. That's the second biggest cost on dairies, is the cost of raising those replacements. If we can bring that survivability or longevity up and reduce the cost of raising that heifer, right there, boom, we're seeing increased profitability on those farms right away. And in the process of the way we go about doing that is also implementing all the regenerative principles across that farm. So that's huge. A lot of farms, they've invested in a lot of brick and mortar infrastructure. And that stuff depreciates like instantly. It has no resale value the day after you pour that yard of concrete. And a lot of them feel that they have to use it 24/7, 365 to justify that expenditure. And I bring this up, Clay, because you talked about interviewing or talking to Larry Tranel. And Larry Tranel's done a lot of analysis on a lot of things. And we use his numbers as we're communicating with dairies. And one of the things Larry Tranel found is what he calls hybrid dairies. They're using that freestall barn. They're using those facilities on the days where it makes sense weather-wise. But on the days it's not, or it doesn't, it's not that critical, those animals are out grazing. They're out stimulating soil biology. They're out there spreading manure. They're out there harvesting their own feed. They're stretching the life expectancy of that infrastructure because there's less wear and tear on it. You don't have to start up the skid loader to scrape the alleys as frequently or the pens as frequently. And so you're stretching out those large capital expenditures, the lifespan of it. You're capturing those fertility, those nutrients coming out of the back end of that cow by depositing and directly on pasture more often than not. Because we were all told to specialize in the 70s in agriculture, we tend to wrap everything in this all or nothing sort of mindset when it comes to whatever we do. And yet where we can mix and match and use the best tool for the day, for the job, for the task at hand, we tend to improve our efficiencies on those things we have already available to us through management. And that alone often will lead to more profitability on these farms. And so just getting folks to think about that is sometimes the challenge. But once they realize that, it opens up this vast array of opportunities to make the best use of the resources they have disposal to.
Yeah. And it, there's, how can it help but be more profitable, at least in my limited perspective? You burn diesel to plant the crop, you burn diesel to harvest the crop, you burn diesel to haul the crop, you burn diesel to feed the crop, you burn diesel to move the
Pump
manure,
the manure, haul the manure.
And so you've got so many steps, and Wally Olson will talk about, we're stacking all this iron and all this diesel fuel on the back of that cow. She's got to carry it around with her everywhere she goes. All the while, as I understand it, God designed a good animal with 4 legs, can get
four-wheel drive, leather upholstery, a forage processor, a forage harvester, a fly swatter, and accessory horns or horn if you want too. So yeah.
And they can do the work. Somebody start a podcast called Working Cows. It'd be a great idea.
Why don't you do that, Clay?
Yeah, I'll think about it. But they can do the work if we will let them. And I think that probably the biggest challenge in making that shift in the dairy industry is, as Nicole Masters says, the paddock between your ears, getting the mind change, right? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. A long time ago, Gabe heard a farmer by the name of Don Campbell make a comment, and it basically goes, and I may be paraphrasing here a little bit, but if we want to make small changes, change how we do things. If we want to make big changes, change how we see things. And when we see the opportunities and how we can work with the design of the natural system out there, oh my goodness. And that doesn't mean we throw everything else out. And we can do these things incrementally. And yeah, we're going to have days where, quite frankly, it would be nice to have the cows inside. I'll talk a little bit about my dairy. My cows only see the inside of a barn. I've only seen the inside of a barn when they're getting milked. And I live in northern Minnesota. Yeah, we got free concrete 5 months out of the year, 4 months out of the year. But, we can manage where and how we have those animals. There's a lot of things we think we need to build into dairy to have a dairy. And yet we've got enough examples out there on people that haven't been sucked into all that infrastructure and have made it work. And as good grief, look at the astronomical cost of replacing machinery. I was talking with somebody the other day, a skid loader, which most dairy farmers will tell you, I will not farm without a skid loader. It's $90,000 to replace a skid loader right now. And it's like, in a lot of these dairies, they're running 2 of them, just the cost of replacing some of this equipment. And the fact that, we used to have this pool of used equipment, mid-size and small used equipment we could tap into. That's kind of going away now. It's getting harder and harder. And what's left that's in good condition is crazy priced because, supply and demand. But the cost, thinking about what are you going to do when that hay bind, when that baler, when that 4th or 5th or 6th tractor or that skid loader needs to be replaced, ask the hard question. Do we need to do that? Is there another way to do that? And so we can make these changes incrementally, but we got to be smart if we're going to stay in business, regardless of our business.
It's a perfect time to identify one of the trends, and I think it's exaggerated even more with dairy farmers than it is maybe with some other farmers, but there's this tremendous fear of loss that seems to supersede any potential gain with the change that's considered. It is a trend, and I guess it's probably very well represented by the trend also in the forage that we're taking off the land and feeding our animals. And so Kent had referenced that, what do you do with all the manure? Well, just think about the trend. So if our practices aren't promoting progress in the realms of what we're producing off the land, what we're feeding our animals, and we're producing less nutrient-dense products, that means our animals have to eat more to get the same nutrients and calories that they would probably yesterday if we're trending negatively. And so then all of a sudden we have all this product that we have to get rid of that has less in it. And so if we're having an increased cost of transporting all this material and we have less value of what we're transporting, you can see where that trend goes in a hurry. So we can probably recognize, without having to put figures to some of these things, the trend is in the wrong direction. And so then there's this fear that anything I might do may accelerate that trend. So, that's where we have to look at things differently. We have to have the conversations from other perspectives. And the perspectives thing is that I can't hardly overstate to say, I'm always looking at a different angle in which to look at something that's going to affect the whole. And that really gets down to the basis of that to begin with. It takes humility to be a good manager. And it takes also the realization that the limiting factor is staring back at you in the mirror.
Yeah.
So much of our training in dairy and education has been looking at things in isolation. And like Doug just said, when we look at things at the whole, it opens up just a host of opportunities, and really doing a good job assessing at where we're at. Are we just treating a symptom, or are we addressing the problem? And often, sometimes that creates real conflict and tension within a dairy. We've seen, for example, veterinarians and nutritionalists at odds with each other because they're looking at things in isolation, or agronomists and a nutritionalist at odds with each other because they're looking at things in isolation. But when we bring the whole picture in there, and once people start to get their minds wrapped around that, it opens up a host of opportunity.
I went out, and as I was trying to prepare for this conversation, went out and listened to an Understanding Ag webinar with Derek Schmitz. Is that right? And he was talking about kind of how he got his start, and he talked about, kind of having a corner in the barn that he could have for some of his own cows, and he got to graze the corners of the fields that they couldn't reach with their equipment on the dairy that he was working on, and that's kind of how he got his start. So are there ways in, I think about maybe experimenting small, even with a larger dairy, experimenting small with some of these different principles and different practices in corners of their barn and in corners of their field where they could experiment small and see how it goes and what's the return on that experiment before they expanded it. Have you seen people use that strategy?
Absolutely, and we encourage that all the time. I was on phone with farms today, encouraging that exact same thing. We try, when we work with a farm, we want to identify those opportunities, and it could be something like you say, off in that corner, doing as we like to say, safe to fail trials with things, finding that more forgiving group of animals such as bred heifers or far out dry cows, to do some grazing on, say, a cover crop for just a short period of time. They've got to get their wheels under them too. Think about when you have a child wants to learn how to ride a bicycle. You start with training wheels, and you keep it short, you keep it simple, and then at some point in time, as their confidence builds, we remove those. And yeah, they still want you by their side in case they're a little wobbly, but pretty soon it's like, no, I can do this myself. And that's where I guess personally, me as working with dairies, like to see them, help them through that process. But we want that day where they can say, I'm good. I got this. I'm comfortable with this. That's what we really want to see. And so it's just finding those opportunities they're comfortable with that work. We call it the low hanging fruit, that work with them and build that confidence. And then we add the next thing and add the next thing, or we expand the scope and scale of that depending on what they're comfortable with.
I'll just add too that I think the agriculture industry has some uniqueness that in order for you to identify opportunity, it's assumed that oftentimes it's a family situation. And so if you are another generation coming up to take over an operation, there's a unavoidable inheritance. Okay. And what I mean by unavoidable inheritance is that this operation was established doing things a certain way. And not very many other industries, from my perspective right now, for this conversation, match that, because you've got all the baggage that comes along with that, and you have to get past that. And it might be that you simply don't know what you don't know, and you can't necessarily just go get a college education to learn the things that you need to identify those things that are going to have an oftentimes pivotal impact on your operation. And so whether they're qualified because of an excuse, because of a region or market or whatever the case might be, if you can't have that education up front, you're going to have a lot of challenges that could have been avoidable. And so education is huge, and sorting through all the information that everybody's going to be willing to give you, and sort through the garbage and sort through the stuff that's actually worth something, it could be a real challenge, because you can't just go and get all that information in one stop, right? So yes, I say take advantage of those opportunities, but man, don't shortchange yourself by not getting as much of the big picture as possible before getting started. Because I think you talk to anybody that's been down this road far enough saying, There's probably a few things I could have avoided that I had to go through. And yeah, there's value to that. But man, sometimes it's tough to get over the hump, and not all farms do, right? Even with good intentions.
One of the hard things about what I do is trying to remember who I should give credit to for what I am about to say. And I'm not sure who to give credit to. I'm pretty sure I didn't come up with this, but peer pressure is exerted by people from across the fence, but tradition is just peer pressure exerted by people from the graveyard, and they're saying this is what this is how we got established, kind of like what you were saying. And so we have to keep doing it this way. And we shouldn't necessarily let those things hem us in from possibilities and opportunities to make changes. But I think that experimenting small is a big part of making change successfully. So you two travel extensively, working with dairies all over the U.S. Are there common practices that you see amongst those farms that are financially profitable?
Management. It really comes down to management. I think if to kind of grab the big concept here, and how they go about managing what they have available to them. I would say that's the big one for me.
Along with that, it is management related, but it's amazing how few farms really still know their cost of production. And if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So to whatever degree a farm is, the ones that are successful, they're taking the time to look at things and evaluate things. Sometimes farmers are reluctant to do that because they don't have the understanding that there's any way to change what they're going to discover. They don't want to know what their cost of production is because they don't think that they have options or alternatives. Or they're, again, fearful of losing something they've established already. But the ones that are looking outward, the ones that are looking for opportunities to get on other people's farms just to learn what they're doing and how it might apply to theirs, man, those are the ones that have a leg up, as opposed to, hey, I've got to get all this done. I don't have time because I have to be working. Well, we can be working a long time and spinning our wheels, where if we just realized maybe not doing something that we're so busy doing is the first step to recovery.
Yeah, just to put it another way, the willingness to get education and continuing to learn, becoming a lifelong learner. None of us have it all figured out. We're all still learning. We call the regenerative ag path a journey. A lot of people are looking for a destination, but yes, we've only scratched the surface on some of what's going on below our feet in the soil. But one of the things we do see is that the regenerative principles keep coming back over and over and over, that they work. Maybe we don't know every little intricate detail of what's going on down there, and we may not. There's so much going on, but we know that the principles hold time and time and time again.
And it doesn't matter how long you farmed either, right? You could be just starting out, or you could have been farming for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years or more. And yet every management decision that you're considering is going to be thrown against those principles to evaluate the potential effect that it's going to have. And it's going to be one way or the other way. I mean, it's not one of those situations where it just never matters. It always matters.
Yeah, there's very, very little neutrality, really, when you start to examine this world. There's very little neutral in pretty much any category. So it's always going to be positive or negative in the end. Kent, you mentioned management as the key, and I think that most people would say, even in a conventional system, they would say, well, we are managing. But I think that maybe the distinction there is that sometimes that management really is more like autopilot. Like this is just what we've always done, rather than looking critically at what we're doing and other opportunities. Is that in line with what you're saying there?
Totally. A lot of people just want to manage, as Doug likes to say, with a pitchfork in their hand, but we're really not taking that objective view that needs to be done and getting the education and looking for other opportunities, and then understanding that often by changing just what we're doing or how we're doing it on a daily basis, just taking those heifers or dry cows out of that pen, even for short periods of time, is a change in management that can have massive implications on the farm.
Well, just ask that question when you get onto the farm, how's it going? And some responses might be, well, I managed to survive. And well, if that's what your goal is, that's one thing too. Are you managing to thrive? Or are you managing to survive? And if we identify that in a lot of our mindsets and looked at the effect that would have with the situation, Clay, that you mentioned as far as the social impact. Are the conversations that we're holding, are they looked to be as constructive conversations? Or are we looking to criticize to try to support a bad practice that we've been doing for generations because it's socially acceptable? I think if we are real with those situations and be serious and understand that, hey, it makes a difference whether those conversations are constructive or not, I think we could really move things a lot further, a lot faster by being honest with each other.
So both of you, as I understand it, are kind of on the grazing dairy side of things. Doug, you are doing heifer development, is that right, in a custom grazing scenario? And Kent, you're in a grazing dairy. So are you seeing more interest in that as you travel the country?
Well, there is to some degree because, opportunities are being looked upon as far as increasing the profit potential of a dairy cow. And so some of these opportunities are in the organic or grass milk markets. Some of it's simply identifying that the scale in which an operation is currently operating isn't sustainable. And so they have to look at other opportunities. So whether or not you're organic or grass fed or not, like Kent said, the low hanging fruit, if we could just entertain the idea of getting bred heifers and dry cows, like far off dry cows on pasture, I mean, man, some of the costs that we are incurring on our operations to support those animals with our current practices, it doesn't have to be accepted, right? I mean, we have alternatives, and that doesn't mean, like Kent said, it's an all or nothing thing. I mean, if you're new to it, you identify a certain time of year where it makes sense. Maybe it's the last cutting of a hayfield, for example, or something like that. But understand the missed opportunity of appropriately integrating livestock on the land is one of the biggest challenges. Once that's realized, there's real potential there.
There's a number of farms I've been working with for several years here now. And within the first year of working with some of these farms, I was very pleasantly surprised at the number of farms who actually put animals outside, mostly grazing cover crops, that first year. I did not expect that many to do it that quickly, but they did. They're excited about it. They continue to do it. They continue to look for opportunities to expand that. They're talking to their neighbors about it. Words in the street in these communities that this is a viable thing, and people are going, never thought it would be, and now here's somebody doing it. They're doing it, and I've been happy with some of the progress we've seen, but it's oftentimes us just helping them, figuring out the logistics of how to make that work, where it makes the most sense, finding that low-hanging fruit, as we said, and then providing just the coaching, as we like to call it, to help them go through that. And once they get a season under their belt, it's a game changer for them. And we're finding the younger, in a multi-generational farms, it's the younger ones who seem to be more enthusiastic about it. And I get fired up about that too, because they're probably going to be doing it for a while. So that's fun to see. And I think they see it as a way to keep that farm viable for them when they come of age.
Yeah, and sometimes the easiest money to make in this industry is the money you don't spend. And so you could probably pay the salary of Junior coming back to the farm if you were putting those far off dry cows and the heifer development in his hands, and a large part of what that looked like was them on pasture and his responsibility to make sure they were where they needed to be with what they needed to be there. Can you see that as a viable scenario?
Absolutely. When we're hearing numbers of, north of $4 a day just for feed for a dry cow, and we've got actual case studies of farms that are feeding, at least for a portion of the year, downwards in the neighborhood of 60 to 70 cents per animal per day. And that's not just feed costs, that's labor, that's land rent, that's seed, that's everything. People sit up and take notice of that. And if you could do that, 60 to 90 to 120 days out of the year, we've known for a long time that we can slash 35 to 50% off the cost of raising heifers just by grazing during the growing season. And then if we can extend that with cover crops and get those dry cows out there that cost a lot and they're not producing much for us at that moment, that starts to add up to some real dollars that, yes, the potential is there, depending on the size and scope of the dairy, to fund a whole entire position on that farm.
That's not to say that we want to paint a picture of all unicorns and rainbows, with the trend in the dairy industry, we've got animals that where the farmer decides, hey, I'm going to start grazing. And we put those animals out in the beautiful, most lush pasture that you want to find. And they look around, they start bellowing, wondering when the TMR is going to come around the corner because they're hungry. And so, look at the effect and the consequences of our management, whether it was intentional or not, right? Because getting back to this bed and breakfast, under the guise of animal and cow comfort, we need to fluff this pillow for them. And so now when we realize maybe the effects of our management over decades and the effect that that's had on the herd, and yeah, that's an asset, but then to what degree is that asset and where do we want to go? It's almost like even in the cropping operation, when we haven't considered a long-term focus on the piece of ground, and we realize that we painted ourselves in a corner with the herbicide history, and we can't plant the cover crops that we want. What's the direct impact of our management? So it may be that we're only going to be able to target a small opportunity in the first year that we want to make a change with getting animals on the ground. But we have to understand the limitations and be able to effectively evaluate our current situation to figure out to what degree we can move forward and how fast.
What's driving this increased interest in grazing dairies? And I think we've talked about some of those things. Is it consumer demand? Is it cost of inputs? Are there some other things that are driving this increased interest?
Cost of production is a big one. Processors wanting product from more regeneratively operated farms, nutrient density food for health and wellness from the consumer, which is getting that's being communicated to the processor, and they want to work that back to the farm. And so those are some that I've seen.
I would say along with that quality of life for the operator and the farmer. I mean, how much time do you really want to spend agitating that putrefied manure in the pit to go pump it out on the land to grow more corn silage when you could go out and move a poly wire and listen to birds sing and have a whole lot easier managing your animals when you want to move them around because they're looking at you as a partner as opposed to a threat, right? So, I mean, a lot of this stuff, we've gradually devoted ourselves from natural processes and realizing that we don't have to accept those situations anymore. That's as much of a driver in a lot of situations, I think, is the next thing. And so when we understand that we can actively play a role in being efficient, being cost effective, and not having to just look forward to what the next loan is for the next piece of concrete, like Kent had mentioned that we have to pour because of the trend that we're in, man, that's pretty liberating. So now we're starting to look at other opportunities. So I would say as much as anything, that and a realization of where we're trending. What are the effects of our past management on what things are going and where are we going to have to change? And looking back to the natural processes and playing a part in that is, I think, one of the next most logical steps for a lot of folks.
Agitating a putrefying manure pit sounds like a crappy job. I had to say it. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Well, and that's not, we're kind of humor about it, but if you think about it, we've got this model that's been the total carbon extraction process, right? In our field situation. So we're growing all this forage to harvest it back. And then we're putting animals in confinement. And one of the biggest things that we're realizing is that we're creating an environment where we have terrible foot and leg issues. And so you take hairy warts, for example, and the one thing that then results in our responding to a symptom by putting in maybe formaldehyde foot baths or copper sulfate. And those products in that slurry pit just decimate beneficial biology. And then when you start agitating that, I mean, you can tell from 1 year to the next, if an operation has never used a foot bath and they start using it in 1 year, the next year it has a distinctly different odor. And it's not positive. Okay. So again, compounding and cascading effects. And now we're putting this out in the landscape and the effect that that's going to have. We're not cycling carbon in place in those fields because we don't have animals on the landscape when we can. And it goes south in a hurry. So yeah, it's a crappy job and it gets worse the worse it gets.
So most dairies, and again, speaking from ignorance here, most dairies, in my understanding, are surrounded by the fields from which the feed source comes. And so it's not necessarily a proximity issue. They could get those animals out there grazing. It's more of a knowledge and infrastructure issue. Is that right?
Sometimes it is. And, oftentimes when even we entertain the idea on a farm that they've never done this before, it's common that the response is, that's just one more thing I don't have time for. And so we need to identify, hey, we're not looking at just adding to your workload. We're looking at taking some things away. We're not having to scrape pens today. We're not looking at having to dress stalls today and haul in all that feed and haul the manure out. We're looking at doing a lot of those processes in one place. Now, unfortunately, not every operation is positioned very well within their land base to be able to do that. And so those are limitations that we have to recognize. But yeah, I mean, there's no place to start like the current. And it's a part of the conversation about how do I appropriately start this and what can I expect?
That milking herd, they do have to come back to get milked once, twice, 3 times a day, depending on the management of the operation. But we can put wheels under, far out dry cows and heifers and take them places. As these farms grow, they're going to pick up little fields here, fields there, either buy or lease, in order to meet the forage production demands to feed all those mouths on that farm. There's often opportunities out there to move those animals that don't need to get milked out there and do some really cool things. And so it's just understanding that, but it's moving past the hurdles. It's providing the resources, the training, the understanding to make that happen, that are all part of this. And that's where we come in. Those are the things we can help identify and help them move forward on, should they want to.
You mentioned feet and leg issues in conventional systems, if we can use that title. Is that a result of living a lot of their life on concrete? And then is that part of the reason why the longevity is increased in a grazing scenario?
It is impacted by so many things. We could probably talk all day, but it's in part environment. So yeah, if you've got wet feet all the time in slurry, that's not real great. But if you have your nutrition of your feed coming in is going down, and you may not even realize it because you're looking at it from one lens, right? With the current evaluation of our evaluation methods on forage analysis, between that and then genetic selection, if we're not allowing the environment to help us decide which animals are going to have a long-term role in our operation and which ones aren't, is we're selecting maybe based on one or two things. I think the industry as a whole has done a way better job than we did 20 years ago. Type and its structure is focused on, but again, is it focused on in the environment in which you have? Is it this industrial model, or is it one that you want the animal to be able to harvest some of their own nutrients out there? Those are potentially two very different perspectives. But yeah, between that, and then if things aren't going as well as possible and we're starting to cut costs, or labor is a challenge, and maybe some things aren't even managed within those systems as well, it can be a real challenge with the foot and leg. And then we're starting to get rid of cows, not because they're not productive with an udder situation, but because they can't stand up.
If I could touch, Clay, just on the nutrient density, piece here, that's so critical to animal health. And Doug and I were you couldn't have asked for a better example. We were on a farm late last summer, 2 corn crops, one on each side of the road. From a distance, looked like the same height and density, as far as plant population and the amount of volume of feed out there. And we pulled sample leaves from each side of the road and took a Brix reading. Brix on a refractometer is a measure of soluble nutrients in the plant. And on one side of the road, the management had been taking a hayfield out and moving it to corn silage that year. So all it had was that history of being a perennial hayfield and a little bit of manure and seed and planting. On the other side of the road, it was 3rd year in corn. And they had put 160 units of urea out there, plus manure out there. On that side of the field, the Brix was half what it was on the other side of the road. Now, the tonnage looked the same, but the nutrient density was far greater. Talk about eye-opening for that producer at that point in time, because when we work with dairies, we often hear, I got to have tonnage, I got to feed these cows. But we know also that when nutrient density is higher, it takes less feed for them to feel satiated. Production stays up, herd health goes up, cost of inputs drop, a lot of these things start falling by the wayside. And so by digging a little deeper sometime and understanding forage quality or nutrient density of that forage quality can be an absolute game changer with things like hoof health, financials, cost of production all become very huge. And so we use those examples when we start talking about the whole and start guiding that farm in a direction to start addressing these things.
Yeah, we've talked about some of the challenges and some of the benefits and some of the ways to overcome challenges as far as grazing dairies are concerned. But what about in the northern environment? I mean, we're talking to two guys here from Minnesota. We talk about, dairies being prevalent in Minnesota and Wisconsin and places like that. Are you seeing profitable dairies, or what are some of the keys to profitable grazing dairies in the northern environment?
One of the things is resources. So one of the things that's causing some dairy farms to relocate, in as far as even in the U.S., is water, right? And so we have water here most of the time. Yes, we're coming out of D4 drought a couple of years ago, but there is that. There is a fair amount of diversity yet. We have resources as far as even supporting businesses. I mean, talking to a few different individuals this last week, and their closest milk equipment dealer is two states away, right? So, I mean, we have equipment dealers for the equipment that we do need on these operations. And we do have, I think, a little bit more pause by our environment to acknowledge the seasons and what impact they're going to have on the operation. So, I mean, unless you have the facilities, you don't want to be calving out there in January or February. And so oftentimes we're looking at milk markets too. They're going to recognize that. We've got capacity right now on our processing facilities that they're all running at 100 to 110%. So we don't have this fluctuation like we maybe once did as far as like the impact on grazing and grass. Honestly, it's a lot easier to get milk out of a cow when she doesn't have heat and flies that we're dealing with. So we're not just talking about just freshening a cow in the spring and grazing while she's lactating. We have different ways we can address that. And logistically, specifically the organic market has some real challenges because of logistics and getting around to pick up milk on their farms and getting it to the processing. It's not necessarily that demand for product isn't out there. It's just getting all those things together. So I think we have some real advantages here in the Midwest, and we have also stock around that's acclimated to our environment. There's a long history of dairy in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and those animals, if you select animals from those regions, they have a leg up than if you're going to bring an animal from another region and expect them to perform in our environment, just as a few examples.
So as far as individual dairies, just looking beyond perennials and the typical pasture situation opens up a host of opportunities. We can work towards stockpiling grass to get us well into November or December on many of these dairies, and then utilizing complex cover crop mixes that are designed to handle snow and stay accessible to the cow, even with some degree of snow load on there. We've got dairies that are grazing into January, maybe not with the milking herd, but again, with these far out dry cows and heifers. Huge opportunity. And animals can walk. We've got operations that animals are walking upwards of a mile, these dry cows and heifers, to water. The water requirements go down during the cool months of the year. If there's snow out there that's accessible to them, oftentimes they won't even come back to water. We've got examples of now crossbred herds that aren't even, they're using snow all winter long. And so we can do some of these things. We've done some of these things in Minnesota. People are doing these things in Minnesota. Every day that cow goes out and harvests her own feed, it's going to help that bottom line versus us firing up a piece of equipment and delivering it to her, as we've been talking about here for quite a while today. So they can handle a lot. They can do a lot. There's ways to do this that take animal comfort into consideration. Even right here in Minnesota, the University of Minnesota out at the Morris Research Center has been outwintering cows, dry cows, and heifers for over 20 years. And the folks in charge out there won't go back to putting those animals in a confinement system. And so there's ways to do this. And then once we get through, our standing forages out there, or the snow gets too deep, then we can look at things like one of the many outwintering techniques and things like bale grazing, or even systematically unrolling or feeding a TMR out there. There's lots of ways to do that stuff that we've surmounted this thing. They don't always have to be in the barn, and in a hybrid system like Larry Trennell talks about, they don't always have to be outside. We can use the best tool in the toolbox that we have available on our farm to meet our production goals.
What would you guys say are some of the keys for dairies being able to take advantage and capitalize on the trend of consumers wanting to know where their food's coming from and more interest in purchasing locally?
I'd start out with saying be accountable. Be accountable for your management and understand the effect your management has on everything, right? And that's going to come right down to your pocketbook, your family life, and that type of thing too. But understand and be willing to have those conversations. Once you truly start to understand and that you have the ability and the power to make change, then we're looking for improving our situations as opposed to the other. Making excuses, is going to be the alternative to that. And excuses have been made for a long time. And it's also, what we tolerate determines our standard, right? So, I mean, if we're going to be content with the erosion that we've got in our landscape, because we have to till, because we have to grow forage for these animals over the winter, because we have winter in Minnesota and we need to put up stored feed, that's not an acceptable position, in my opinion. We can do better, and I think we need to expect better. So if we're recognizing where we're at and where we want to go, and we can have constructive conversations to where we want to where we want to be in the future, then when we're talking to the consumer of our product, they understand where we're at. They better understand our limitations, but then they're a partner in the journey. And sometimes it just needs to go from the perspective of being defensive to, looking at things from a different perspective and saying, yeah, we can do better.
Health and wellness is such a big business. It's absolutely huge. And we know that the regenerative practices that build soil health lead to nutrient-dense food. And there's more information coming out on this all the time. And we're going to be working on some of that this summer. Doug's got a proposal to do some very extensive analysis with Dr. Stefan Van Vliet here in the coming months. And that's what a huge portion of the consumer market out there demands. That's what they want, and they're willing to pay for it. And to stay relevant in dairy, especially for small dairies, this may be your avenue forward.
And I think that kind of goes to the follow-up question I neglected to ask, and maybe Doug touched on it with the quality of life issue, but that there are other metrics for profitability other than just financial profitability. There's health and there's community. We can analyze the benefits to the neighborhood that we are bringing and some of those things. So if there's others that you want to talk about specifically, but I think that it's important to call attention to the fact that we're not just talking about the financial bottom line, but as I think maybe it was Alan Savory popularized, the triple bottom line. Money, community, and land are all three we need to keep an eye on them.
Absolutely. Who's downstream? And they're watching. Consumers may be willing to pay for health and wellness, but they expect ecological stewardship. They expect that. And to deny that could be detrimental to your ability to continue as a business.
I don't know what it's like in the dairy industry, but in the NCBA, when you start talking about the stewardship award every year for the NCBA, it's almost always going to be an operation that is upstream from a large city, and they're gonna highlight what they're doing to protect soil and water quality for those downstream city neighbors. Those guys are almost always going to win those awards. Not that it's not a meritorious award, but those guys have a better shot at winning those awards because we're trying to communicate that story to our city cousins and neighbors. So I think that's it bears out in other industries, right?
Yeah, maintaining social license to operate is going to be, and it is, and going to be critical in the future. And the consumer and the public and our neighbors in town and even in the country who don't farm have a set of expectations, and that expectations has changed over time. But they can be addressed, and we can address it using these principles. So,
yeah. And along with people development of rural agriculture land into suburban land, there comes that regulatory pressure of them not wanting to live next to a feedlot necessarily, and so, that becomes a real issue in a lot of localities. And so there's different ways that we can approach our management to, as you said, maintain that social license. So it's a real challenge for sure.
It can be a huge opportunity to build relationships with those neighbors and with consumers. And if we look at it as that, instead of just opposition against what we've traditionally or have been trained to do, we get to choose that path. And if we choose the right path, it can be a very powerful voice for agriculture and build a lot of allies.
Yeah. And I think the recency is important. Like you said, in the 70s, we were instructed to specialize, and if we could get back to some of that picturesque farm that people have in mind, as far as they're driving down the county road and they see dairy cows out grazing, that those things even play a role and can be an important part of maintaining that social license and the relationship with the neighborhood.
And that's not a new phenomenon, that ideal of a pastoral setting. Go back to some of the artists from the 15, 16, 1700s. What did they paint?
Yeah.
A huge chunk of that art back then was pastoral landscapes. It's built into our psyche that we appreciate that we desire that we want that to be part of our life, whether we farm or not. And it's been around for millennia. And you want to build good neighbors, create those opportunities. I've watched on my own farm, people who will come out, ride bike out, walk out, take the stroller out, and stop. And when those animals are out on pasture and they're looking content, their rumens are full, they're laying down, it's a nice evening. Those people are enjoying that. They're enjoying seeing that, and that's part of that community piece.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes to this last question as we point towards wrapping up. Those are probably some of the ways that small dairies can ensure a future in the industry. We started out talking about consolidation, but what are some of the ways that you see paths forward for small dairies to ensure their future in the operation or in the industry?
Yeah, support from their neighbors, support from their community, providing nutrient-dense food, keeping their cost of production down, having a quality of life that's going to attract that next generation. And that can lead to other market opportunities out there. All of these pieces come together under the umbrella of regenerative ag.
Clay, you mentioned Simon before, and why. He's infamous for asking the question why. And if we took the time and we were good about answering those questions, like having that little toddler run behind us, and every time we're doing an operation or something like that, answering why. I mean, it's amazing how many folks really can't answer the question why they're farming. And it's empowering when you start to think about, hey, that we do have the ability to have a positive impact on our communities, on the person that's inquiring on raw milk sales, for example, or direct marketing products from your operation because they believe in what you're doing. They give credit to your intent, and they're willing to walk with you and partner with you because they recognize the trend of our communities in general with our healthcare costs, the conversations that we're having with our food and nutrient density in our foods, and they want to know more. So I think, like you said, collectively, yeah, we can do so much better collectively. And answering those questions, but really being thoughtful about things and looking beyond our farm and the impact that we have. So being aware, being sensitive, and not just simply making excuses for mistakes in the past, and being open to change are the best ways, I think, that we can be viable as far as any operation, and even more so a small dairy.
Yeah. Innovate. If we're not moving forward and we're not willing to change, then we're kind of in the process of dying already, right? Yeah, very good stuff, guys. I really appreciate the time today. Maybe as we close here, you two dairy guys make the case for the beef guy coming to a soil health academy on a dairy farm. What would be some of the benefits that you would see for them to do that?
So for years, I told farmers, especially if they've got cattle, and I don't care if they're dairy cows or beef cows, we can learn from each other. There are things that you may not pick up going to something. Let's not box ourselves or paint ourselves in a corner and be so siloed that we don't feel we can learn something from. Take advantage of those opportunities that come around. If you're a grazing beef dairy, go to a grazing dairy, a grazing beef operation, go to a grazing dairy operation, and vice versa. You're going to see and learn things you may not going other places. So I encourage people to go. Just don't get turned off just because it says one or the other. Look at it as an opportunity and to build your own network.
So like I said before, Clay, with looking at life through a different, multiple perspectives, there's one thing to be said about a dairy farm. And if you were looking at the comparison between managing a dairy operation compared to managing a beef operation, the dairy guys' challenges are going to be enhanced almost twofold, just because of what we're asking of those animals. And so if you're looking at identifying challenges that you want to be aware of as you're managing your operations, a dairy operation is a great example to look upon if you're looking at rearing beef animals as far as how to approach things, what are things to look for. There's tremendous opportunity there. But not only that, again, having those conversations between different production perspectives, there's always something to be learned.
Yeah, and as of this recording, there's still room in the Soil Health Academy School taking place in Cold Spring, Minnesota, June 20th through the 22nd. And registration in the Soil Health Academy includes the Regen Ag 101 course. So I think there's a lot of value there and a lot of opportunity for people to kind of get their perspective shift. And as of the release of this episode, there's still a couple of months out. So still time for people to plan to go to that specific school and see their operation there and get your perspective expanded. So I think that would be a good opportunity for people. Thank you, guys. Appreciate your time today. Anything else that we missed or anything else we need to cover?
Thanks, Clay. Can't think of anything at the moment here. Really appreciate the opportunity to be on with you.
A good conversation.
Very good stuff there. As always with Understanding Ag, you come to expect it, right? Just a lot of value and a lot to ruminate on. And again, I would encourage you to take us up on that offer and go get signed up at the Soil Health Academy that is taking place there in Minnesota, and get your mind stretched a little bit outside of your own comfort zone and outside of what you're familiar with, and maybe learn something new there. And it's a Soil Health Academy at the end of the day, so it's going to be great content. Really encourage you to do that. Coming up here just in a couple of days, Lord willing, from the release of this episode, we'll be talking to Jared Sorensen with agsteward.fyi. Really excited to share this conversation with you. Really great conversation with Jared about what they're doing there to help improve the profitability of people through the coaching and consulting that they are doing there. So be on the lookout for that. Make sure you're subscribed at workingcows.net/subscribe. And we'll be seeing you again real soon with another episode of the Working Cows Podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.